of all, welcome to my senior mastery. This is more for my panel members than for you guys, but you guys have a QR code in front of you. If you want to scan it, this leads to my mastery website where all of the fun documentation is. So, this is my mastery. I did my senior mastery on using word choice to detect political bias in news articles. But before I tell you about that, I'm going to go all the way to the very beginning, and we're going to start. First, I'm going to introduce my panel. So this is Miss Riley, who is my AP capstone teacher. This system I also built in combination with my AP research work, so I'm really happy to have her here. She's watched me toil. Miss Penn, who I would have here even if she wasn't my informatics major teacher, as my theater teacher, because she teaches about half the classes I take at this point. Miss Stephanie Yancey, who is a media specialist, a gov and psychology teacher, and also my mother. And Dr. David Yancey, who is associate registrar at CCU and my dad. So now we're going to start at the beginning. These are my breaths works. So these are all of the works that I have worked on over the course of the actually 3 years that I've been in informatics, because I took it sophomore to senior year. So this is the very first thing that I built in informatics. It is about as basic as you can functionally get. It's built in Google Sheets, and it is an inventory system for Bath and Body Works. So basically this uses a function called VLOOKUP, and you can put a type of inventory in there. It'll tell you how many of that inventory you have in stock. It is by no means the most complicated thing that has ever existed, but it is the first thing that I built. So this is the first project that I built in Microsoft Access, which is a database software. I've since learned that I hate Microsoft Access with a burning passion, but that's something that's important to have learned. This is a website that does inventory for a flower shop. So it's hosted on something called Microsoft SharePoint. Basically, you can go to this website and you can click on these forms. It'll open up a form like that, and you can fill in the inventory for this flower shop, click submit, and it'll put that inventory into a database. This is possibly the ugliest thing that I've ever built in informatics. It's really, really bad. It is just barely functional. But I think there's a lot of growth between it and the last project that I built in Microsoft Access, which you'll see just a little bit later. So I think it's important to have in here just to show growth. This is my first project from Informatics 2, and something I should tell you about Informatics 2 is that because I have no chill at all whatsoever, I was not actually taking this as a regular class. I was taking an extra class that semester, and what that meant was all of the rest of my classmates were in person doing things like normal human beings, and I was pretty much exclusively online. So I think I came into this class maybe 3 times the whole semester. So what that ended up being was, first of all, I learned a lot about communication because I was communicating pretty much exclusively virtually, and it meant that I didn't have a lot of time to troubleshoot with my team, and that ended up working out really wonderfully because they used my prototype pretty much wholesale as our team prototype. I kind of came in, it was presentation day, I was like, here you go, they were like, great, and we presented. It took about an hour. So what this does, it is a gallery of medical images. You can see right here, these are all medical scans, and you put them in this website and they are universally accessible. So what I learned a lot about during this was working with different image types, because I don't know if you know this, but most medical images are what's called DICOM files. They do not work with most software. You need special software to unlock them, to move them, and to put them in a gallery like this. So I learned how to do that. I also learned a lot about security because HIPAA is a thing. We had to figure out how to make the website secure enough that doctors could get in and access those files and patients could see their own files, but any random person who happened on this website couldn't find everyone's medical information. The last thing is a tagging system. Right here, each one of those pictures is tagged with the gender, the age, and the type of scan of the person it's representing, so you can go into this database and search for, say, I want 18 to 21-year-old female rib scans. And when this database is much bigger and you can't locate everything in it, that makes it really easy to find relevant materials. So this is the aforementioned last Microsoft Access project, affectionately referred to as the Etherson database because it is for Miss Etherson, who is our wonderful, wonderful DC teacher. She has a lot of inventory that is what's called Kate funded, so it comes from money from the district. And with that, with money from the district comes generally a lot of paperwork. So you have to pay attention to where you're transferring these things and when you dispose of them and where they're going and who they're with. And this was in a I love you, Miss Etherson, frankly atrocious spreadsheet. So
that's why I don't teach informatics.
So we put it in a database for her. Again, I was doing this pretty much virtually. I had no fourth block at the time, so I would come in and sit in the theater in fourth block, and Ms. Penn would update me on what the rest of my class had done that morning, and I would try to fix it. Communication and adaptability were big on this one too. I think there was a significant number of times that I walked into the informatics classroom and talked to either Jack or Nick and been like, what did you do? Help me fix this. So what I ended up doing was a lot of aesthetics. All of that aesthetic stuff was me. It's why it's not Times New Roman 12-point font on a white background. You're welcome. But also I did implementation. So I was the one who actually went into Ms. Etherson's classroom. I talked to all of her students. I tracked down 400 some individual inventory items and put barcode stickers on them. And I put every one of her students in the database. And what I learned from that is that things that work beautifully in a theoretical environment in a classroom do not work beautifully out in the real world. So I learned a lot about how you kind of roll with the problems that come up when you roll something out to a client and the way that you can adjust your system to make it work for the individual person you're sending it to. All right, course 3. This is my most aesthetic project ever. There's not a ton behind it, but it is very, very pretty. This was educational Scratch game design, and basically what it is a block coding software. You string blocks together and it does a very basic sort of code. I had some experience in this already, thank you Middle School Science Olympiad, but because I had that kind of background knowledge, I got to focus on one, getting a game that matches South Carolina educational standards, because we had to sit there and make sure our game matched specific standards for each grade level, but also I got to make it very, very pretty and kind of have fun with it. So this is my little potion shop. You answer math questions to get coins, and then you and your partner pick potion ingredients that do different things off the shelf, and you're trying to make a potion that is stronger than your partner's. So this was a little tiny mini project. It probably took us about a week overall, but it's by no means my most complicated, but it is very pretty and I'm proud of it, so I wanted to put it in here. This is my most intense project. So this is probably the most in-depth thing I've ever built in informatics, and the bane of everyone in my class's existence for like a good solid 3 or 4 weeks. What this is doing is basically, if you know the Cinemark app where you can pick the date and time of the movie that you want to see, and then you can pick your seat, it's basically that. So what we started with was, okay, we have to put this movie data into a database. Cool, we got that. We know how to do that. It took us 3 or 4 days to learn how SQL databases work, and we got through that. Then comes, it needs to be cloud accessible, and you need to put it on the internet. SharePoint is really, really bad at putting databases on the internet. So we needed another thing to do. Overall, a project will probably take my class 3 or 4 weeks, start to finish. We probably spent 3 weeks trying to host this thing on the internet. Eventually, I am so proud, I am the one who figured it out. We ended up using a website called Infinity Free that does free hosting. Shout out to my dad for sitting with me at 11 p.m. figuring out how to host on a website that would not immediately corrupt my computer. So I got that software started up, and basically what it does is it gives you a database and an HTML window and says go. So I learned how to code in HTML to build a website, in PHP to interact with the database, and then in SQL to build and search through said database. This one was all problem solving. We had no idea what we were doing. It was the very first project of course 3. We were all a little scared, but ultimately we did make it through it. And that brings us here. This is my mastery. It's basically what I worked on for the entirety of course 4. And it started with Miss Murley, who is a social studies teacher at Myrtle Beach High School. And she talked to my mom one day, and my mom came home and said, you should do your mastery on why people keep having problems with me showing news. Because lots of times when social studies teachers want to teach current events, they will show some kind of student news. So if you've ever seen CNN 10, New York Times Learning Network, those are news designed specifically for students. You would think that this would be a pretty normal and non-debatable topic. You would be very wrong. There is pretty much constant debate over whether showing news to kids is showing them a form of bias, and whether it's giving them biased information and indoctrinating them into their parents' viewpoints. And just recently, this is last year, a Pennsylvania school removed CNN entirely, and this is not an isolated incident. I think this is stupid. So I wanted to figure out a way not only to fix it, but also so that I could tell people that they were wrong. So the rationale for this is I thought if people are arguing over bias, then I was raised in a cite your source kind of household. I want an objective way to measure that bias. I want to be able to come with numbers and with sources and tell you this source is biased or it is not. So the goal of this was to build a system that did that completely objectively. So my objective, I just told you, build a tool that analyzes the level of language bias in news articles so that you can determine the level of bias in news. And the technique for this, I ended up using something called machine learning, along with natural language processing, which I'm going to tell you a lot about more in a minute because I know that that doesn't make any sense to anybody but me. But I used it to create a lexicon of partisan words that you could then use to determine language bias. For right now, the only thing you need to know is machine learning is not AI. It is not coming for you. That's different. It's a different mastery. Come back later. So, as I was going over this research, here are a couple of the topics I explored. I'm going to tell you all a little bit more about them in a minute. I started with hostile media perception, which is basically a theory that states no matter what kind of person you are, when you look at something completely unbiased, you will inevitably view it as bias against you, no matter what your viewpoint is. I also looked at what was causing the debate over bias and who were the people doing the most in the debating. I learned about language and labeling bias, which is what I ended up focusing my mastery on because there's lots and lots of different ways that you can indicate bias. This was just the one that I chose. And I learned about some existing systems and existing tools for doing this kind of analysis, of which there are not many. So the first thing that I started with was, okay, so if we're going to argue about bias, what gives me any right to tell? So if I'm going to argue with you and you think CNN is biased and I think it's unbiased, how can either of us tell, and do we actually know what we're talking about? And as it turns out, the answer is absolutely not. So there is this process called hostile media perception in which even if a source is completely unbiased, you are going to view it as bias against yourself. And it doesn't matter what your political view is or what your ideology is, you inevitably view it as hostile against you. And this goes with something called social judgment theory, which basically means that you are likely to reject a source that doesn't already work with your current viewpoint. What this means is that no matter how you perceive a source, no matter how well educated you are, pretty much your indication of bias is completely invalid. You have no idea what you're talking about because you cannot be trusted to accurately determine it yourself. So I then went on to figure out who are the people who are causing the most debate over this. Is it parents or teachers or administrators? And what I found is across pretty much all platforms, the people who are doing the most debating are the people who are most politically active and most politically informed. And I read that and I went, well, great, okay, they're politically informed, they're probably more likely to be able to do this, right? Exactly the opposite, actually. So the more politically active you are, typically the stronger your ideology gets as you kind of refine your viewpoints. So what that actually means is because your ideology is stronger, it extends what's called your latitude of rejection and means that you are so much more susceptible to hostile media perception. You are so much more likely to find things that are completely unbiased as bias against you because you have such specific views. So, like I said, there are lots of different types of ways to analyze bias. What I settled on is language and labeling bias because I thought it was interesting and also because it's pretty easy to quantify for a type of analysis like this. But what language and labeling bias is the word that you use to label a concept. So for instance, if I'm having an abortion debate with you and you refer to something as a fetus and I refer to it as a baby, we are referring to the same concept, but we're framing it in completely different ways. They're meant to invoke different emotions. So authors do this all the time in their work, and lots of times it's subconscious. It's just the way that you communicate. So by looking at this, it's a really good example of how you can indicate subconscious bias in your work and how you can read for that to go back and check yourself, because lots of times you can't even really tell. So here are some of the existing tools I looked at. What I found was there weren't a lot of tools that already do this kind of analysis, but the ones that were almost entirely qualitative analysis, which means that basically they sit a person down and they tell them, read this document, tell me if it's biased or not. And that's great. It means that you get a lot more nuance in the type of bias you can see, but it also means that it is still inherently subjective. You are relying on the people in your study to tell you what bias is and isn't. It's also, there's lots of limited research due to the fact that it's super subjective, but the best thing that I found was this article called Auditing the Partisanship of Google Search Snippets. And a Google search snippet is when you do a Google search and there's that 2 or 3 lines of text right below the title, that's a Google search snippet. So I looked through this article and I found that they did this lexicon system that was super accurate, it was simple enough for me to replicate, and it was a really good way to determine what kind of language was Democratic language and what kind of language was Republican language. So I ended up replicating this along with a couple of other open source tutorials pretty heavily when I built my own tool. So here are some of the tools that I used in coding. Like I said earlier, machine learning, and machine learning is a type of computing where it's essentially computerized pattern recognition. So you give a computer a training data set to learn off of, it recognizes the patterns in that data set, and then you can give it something it doesn't know, and it goes back and looks for those patterns. So that's what I ended up using. I also used a field of computing called natural language processing. I'm not sure if you know this, but computers are really, really bad at determining human language. They cannot derive meaning from any kind of language. So natural language processing is a process by which you turn human language into something that computers can read and then go back and analyze. I also learned a lot about web scraping, which is basically when you send something out into the internet to pull HTML code, and then you can break apart that HTML code and use it however you want. So it's just automatic pulling data from the internet. I also ended up using a virtual machine because if you have ever tried to do pretty much anything in this school, you will know that our computers are locked down like Fort Knox. I could not do anything. I could not get to a Python console. So Replit is a virtual machine that's basically a full computer just hosted online that would let me do that kind of programming. And then a couple of open source packs that I ended up using, NLTK, which stands for Natural Language Toolkit, scikit-learn, and then a data vectorization software. And what a vectorizer does is it splits a group of text, like a paragraph, into the words that exist in it. So it can say, okay, cell was used in this paragraph 13 times, science was used 9 times, so on and so forth. So this is my product. I'm gonna walk you through a little bit about how it works, and then I'm gonna show it to you because I think it's really cool. So the first step that I had to do with this is creating a training data set for the computer to learn off of. This is called a corpus. It is basically means a body of document, but it does sound really morbid because Latin. So what I chose to do as my training data set was every public statement made by US senators from January 2020 to November 2022. That is a giant corpus. It is basically 50,000 documents by the time I was done, but that is what that article that I was talking about earlier used, and I thought it was reliable enough and had prior precedent that I could go back and use it. So I pulled it from votesmart.com, which basically catalogs every public statement made by US politicians, and I built a web scraper. So it went out into the world, it pulled the HTML from every public statement page on votesmart.com for a senator, it extracted that public speech and it saved it as a text file. Cue approximately 57 folders in my Replit account and a very, very slow Replit for the next couple of days. So once I had that corpus, you do the analysis on it, which involves basically building a database of words and whether they are Republican or Democrat. So the way you do that is you take your corpus and it uses natural language processing to process the statements. So it takes a document, it puts it into a giant database called a data frame, and what it does first is it does something called balancing the corpus, which basically means that there's an equal number of Republican documents as there are Democratic documents. That way your analysis isn't skewed one way or the other. So after that, it does that process called vectorization and counts up, okay, the word cells occurred 19 times in a Republican speech, and the word science occurred 12 times in a Democratic speech, and does a bunch of fancy probability to tell you, okay, overall, the word science is more likely to be a Democratic word than a Republican word, and the word science and the word cell is more likely to be a Democrat word than a Republican word. That way you can go back and I can say, if you're using this language, it is more probable that you're a Democrat versus a Republican. So, after you do that, you end up with a giant lexicon of approximately 21,000 entries that will make your Google Sheets work horribly every time you open it. And you take that lexicon and you use it to analyze a document that you don't know the partisanship of. And how that works is a very similar process. You take that article and you put it in, it vectorizes it and counts up how many times each word occurs. And then it goes and it looks through my lexicon. So it says, okay, so the word science is included in this article. Let me go see if it's in the lexicon, and if it is in the lexicon, it pulls its bias score. Bias scores are calculated on a scale from -1 to 1, with -1 being only ever used by Democrats and 1 being only ever used by Republicans. So after you do that, you get a bias score for every word in the article, you average it, and it gets you the overall score for the article. So, after I built this whole system, I got it working the way I wanted to, and I had kind of an opportunity that I don't think I would have had if I had just used this for my senior mastery, because I built this for my AP research project, which is actually comparing student news to adult news and the levels of bias it has. So I got to do some testing protocol that I don't think I would have ever had time for otherwise. I ended up running about 4,000 news articles through it across 6 sources, and I ran the entire system, lexicon generation and all, twice before I was reasonably happy with the consistency of the results it was putting out. That took probably about 2 months to run the entire system twice. There are a couple of limitations to this system. Thank you, Jack, for pointing this out to me via goodsciencing.com. It assumes good faith. So it assumes when you are talking about science, you actually mean science. You are not trying to lie to it. So it's really bad at identifying misinformation. It's also fundamentally impermanent because the issues we talk about change and the way we use language changes, so you would have to re-up this lexicon probably every 6 months to keep it current enough to be accurate. It is also not a perfect indicator of bias. Like I said, there's lots and lots of ways to indicate bias, so you should not use this as your end-all be-all and storm the gates of CNN. So, when you run this program start to finish, it generates lots and lots of data, of which I'm going to show you a much cleaner, prettier version than what it gives me. But when you run the lexicon, it gives you the entire lexicon of entries, plus, via the power of sorting, the top 20 and top 20 Democratic and Republican words, and the top 20 words overall, which I'm going to show you because I think it's funny. When you run the document analyzer on a document, it generates 3 documents that you can download as CSVs. One that counts the total occurrences of every word in the document, one that gives you the score for each word, and then one that gives you the whole article score. So, we're going to do this on a sample document. This is a document just recently posted by the New York Times. It's about the availability of the abortion bill, a Supreme Court case that just went through, and I'm going to run this through my lexicon so you can see how it works. So this is a version of it that I built especially for my senior mastery so that I wasn't trying to run it with about 4,000 documents in it still. It is still going to take a minute to load though. So it starts with this prompt to enter your file name, and I already put this argument in here. You put it in just the text, no pictures or anything. So what it generates is, and it's not done yet, but it generates these things called data frames, and they basically are giant, incredibly complex spreadsheets. So this is what it gives me, just raw data-wise, and this is incredibly difficult to understand if you don't know what you're looking at, so we're gonna do it in a spreadsheet instead. So this is the lexicon entry. It generates a little bit more data than this, but this is what you really care about. The phrase, the number of times it occurs in all of those public statements I just mentioned, and then its bias score, so whether it leans Republican or Democrat. So you can see this goes on and on and on, but the closer something gets to 1, the more likely it is to be a Republican word, for instance, 100 employees. The closer something gets to -1, the closer it's going to get to a Democratic word. So we're going to look at the top 20 Democratic and Republican, because I think it's a little hilarious. So under Democrat, you have negotiate drug, polls, bold climate, national paid, pretty much all stuff. I don't know how to.
It's right, yes, go to that 100%, left side, yes, thanks. Beautiful, thank you.
Okay, so this is all stuff that you would pretty heavily associate with things that you hear Democrats talking about pretty regularly. You got protect reproductive, protected status, and these are all basically 1 or 2 word strings. Via the Republican side, Omaha is a word that I don't really know the meaning of, but because of the way it vectorizes, sometimes little odd words that you don't really know come up through. But you got 100 illegal, socialist agenda, skyrocketing inflation, funding abortion, sanctuary cities. Liberal wish, I think, is really funny. But this is all completely statistic, it's unbiased, it is literally the words that they use most often. So liberal wish over here is used 104 times in the course of these documents that I looked. Never once by Democrats. So when we run through that document I just showed you, the one about the Supreme Court, you get this, which is the number of occurrences of each word. So it uses the word judge 18 times, court 17 times, and this is about 400 rows as it figures out every word in that document. So it takes this and it searches for all those words in the lexicon. So it communicates with that lexicon I just showed you, and it says, okay, this article has the word judge in it. Go through the lexicon, find the word judge, and it pulls its bias score and saves that. So in this case, the word judge has a bias score of 0.0221, which is a little bit Republican, but not horribly. Court, on the other hand, is negative 0.033, which is about the same amount Democratic. So you take all of these word scores and you multiply the bias score by the number of times it occurs and average that all together, and you get the average score for the whole document. So for this particular article, it's got a negative 0.001 bias score, which means it leans just a little Democratic, which is what we would expect from a source like New York Times, but nothing that would be considered egregious. So that's what happens when you do it for one document. Here's what happens when you do it for a lot of documents. So this, I'm gonna zoom out so you can see all of it. This is what I did for my AP research. So I scraped every single article the New York Times, CNN, PBS posted over the month of November 2022, and I got all of their article scores and averaged them together to get the overall bias of a source. So here's what happens when you get all of those documents together and you can average them together on a large scale as soon as this loads. So this is results by source. I told you I did New York Times, CNN 10, PBS, as well as their according student news. And what you can see is that New York Times and CNN both have less bias than their student counterparts. PBS is kind of a weird outlier, and it's probably because it has a much smaller sample size. But when you do this, you are able to tell kind of overall over a period of time how biased a source is. So it's not it's helpful on a single article, but really it's useful when you average them together and you can get an overall look at the source. Also, I did it over time. So this is the average of every day in November for every article posted. So everything that CNN posted on November 3rd got averaged together and turned into a data point. And what you can see here is that New York Times and CNN get kind of center, so they lean Democrat, but they don't really fluctuate that much, whereas the student news kind of goes up and down all over the place, but ultimately it ends up with a lower bias score and more unbiased than its adult counterparts. What I also think is really interesting is that if you look right around November 8th, you will notice that pretty much every adult source takes a massive leap in bias score. They get significantly more politically biased surrounding November 8th, which is US Election Day. Conversely, the student sources get significantly less bias, which kind of indicates that as you get closer to Election Day, adult sources get more bias and lean more on political reporting, whereas student sources kind of sense the political tension and they pull back on political reporting, and they make things as unbiased as possible. Also, everything gets less bias around Thanksgiving because national unifying holiday, everybody sings Kumbaya, and we take a break from arguing over each other's political parties for 2 or 3 days. So, now that I've finished all of this, it was a massive undertaking, 6 or 8 months of my time between AP Research and Senior Mastery. Here is everything that I think. So overall, this project let me learn a lot of stuff that I didn't get to touch on in informatics. We learned a lot in database and website hosting, but this let me go into web scraping, which is a whole world of computing on its own, and then machine learning and natural language processing, which got me into a section of the Anaconda Data Science competition that I would not have gotten into otherwise. I also ended up working on a much faster timeline than you would expect for a senior mastery, because I was going to have to use this in my AP research, whose project I'm giving next week. And by the time that I had to sit down and write everything, it had to be done. The product had to be completely finished, and I had to have used it for this massive undertaking. I actually ended up liking that a lot better, because by the time I sat down to write my ultimately approximately 20-page paper, it was done. So I didn't have to sit there and worry about whether it was going to change over the course of when I finished building it. I kind of already knew where everything was going to pan out. Also, I ended up writing in like 2 or 3 page sections via Miss Penn and Miss Riley. Thank you for that, because I could not have written 5,000 words-ish otherwise. I think I would have cried. So my experience overall in informatics, I came in here fully intending to be a computer science major. I did not, because Mr. Vaught, who I love very much, retired when I was in freshman year, and I like Miss Penn a lot, and she said, okay, they're gonna make me teach informatics. And I came with her because it sounded cool, and I didn't really know what major I wanted to end up in anyway. This is now what I'm going into a career path in. So I'm really happy that I ended up here and I got to have this kind of basis of knowledge. I made some of my genuinely closest friends in my major, because there are some friends that you can only make when you have been staring at the same problem for 3 weeks and you decide that you need coffee. So genuinely people I don't think I would have met otherwise, and I'm really happy that I got to know. Also, I learned a lot about this course, and it wasn't necessarily in content so much as it was in learning style. We do project-based learning, which is basically they're going to give you a project. You have 3 or 4 weeks where you do only that, start to finish. This was not great for my ADHD brain for a little bit. I have some trouble focusing, but ultimately I really like getting to work on something all the way through its completion. I also learned just-in-time teaching, which I thought was possibly a torture technique at first, but basically it means that they don't tell you the answer until you are either really, really struggling or you have no idea. So if we ran into a problem and we were not going, okay, Miss Penn, tell me the answer now, Google it first. We used Google, we figured out our own stuff, and we came up with our own solutions to such a point that, like, when the classes come after us, we come in and say, okay, how did they figure this out? Because something like the GPA generator we built, we come in and Miss Penn shows us what the next class is built, and we're like, huh, didn't think of that. Also, specialization. I like to do everything myself. I have since learned that this is not a way that you can operate on a team or in a project. So what I've found is that I really like to build things. I like to solve the problem the first time. I'm not super into making it elegant or efficient, and I can get through technical writing via my AP Lang classes, but I will hate every moment of it the whole time. So shout out to Nicholas Crowder, who's written all of my technical documents for the last 3 years. Thank you for that. Finally, defending your ideas. Pretty much every project we put through, including this one, we show to a panel of industry experts and students and sometimes college representatives, and you have to be able to stand up and say, here's why I made the choices that I made, here's the choices that I chose to go with, and sometimes when they ask you a question, you have to learn to say, I'm sorry, but this was not in the scope of this project. So, my future plans. This is actually the first time I've gotten to say this in public. I'm very excited. I am going to Clemson University Honors College as a breakthrough scholar next year on a full cost of attendance scholarship to study computer science. Ask my mom about that later. So, very excited about that. I'm going to get my BA in computer science. I plan on minoring in history or political science because of what I want to end up doing as a job, and I'm going to do a ton of undergraduate research. I'm actually going this summer to do undergraduate research on Clemson's campus, and probably afterwards graduate school in either informatics or computer science, depending on what job I want to end up getting into. So, for my career, like I said, I'm going into information science. No idea how we got here, but it is what I want to do. I will probably end up doing independent consulting because I don't like to work under managers, and I like to come in and solve the problem and get out. My dream job is working in the Smithsonian or the National Archives. They do a ton of stuff with historical data science and about tagging all of their systems and kind of sending it out into the world so that other people can access it. And I'm going to keep working in theater, probably doing consulting because I really enjoy it. These are my wonderful acknowledgements. Thank you, Ms. Murley, for the original idea, Ms. Penn for constantly keeping me on track and rerouting me over the course of this very long project, Ms. Riley, for without you I would not know how research works or how to write a paper, and I would have probably been very upset this entire time. Mr. Washburn and Dr. Weinhold, who came and guest spoke with us and told me a lot of really interesting things about the work that I was doing. Jack and Israel, who sat for I don't know how many lunch breaks and fixed code for me because I had no idea what I was doing. Without them, I think it probably would have taken much longer and I would have been much less efficient. And my parents, because they kept me alive and they listened to me rant at 11 p.m. because I couldn't figure out how Python worked.
So most of you present know how this works. We'll turn to our panel first for questions if you have them, and then we'll open it up to anyone else. If you are on a time clock and you need a little bit of planning time, feel free to duck out. This is a good point. But I'll give you just a moment to transition if you need to go elsewhere, because thank you other teachers for coming because you love Mia. We'll start down that way. We'll start with our official panel, and of course we'll grab other folks too. Ms. Riley, would you like to start us off?
Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin. I guess in the dream world idea of this project in particular, where can you see it going?
I would like to hook it up to a web application and make it publicly available. Right now it kind of exists on Replit. It is public, you can get to it if you want to, but it requires some kind of computer science knowledge. So I'd like to get it somewhere in a format that other people can access it and look through it. And Ms. Penn actually gave me this idea. I want to make like a Grammarly so that it'll read the document for you and tell you kind of, and that would require some refining, but that's where I'd like to go with it if I had time.
Yeah, move on down. Or throw in a question or a comment, whatever
Even
you.
the hard ones.
You had mentioned when you did the Etherson database. What did
That's his
you?
name now. We all call it that.
What did you learn about designing user interfaces in theory versus how people use them?
I believe you refer to this as an ID10T error. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. People will push buttons that they should not push.
Yep.
They will do things in orders they should not do them.
Yep.
Just make everything as idiot-proof as possible. Make
still
buttons. Make back buttons. We didn't have back buttons until the last 2 weeks of this project when I was doing implementation, and I coded them because I got tired of rebacking everything up so that someone else could use it again.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So I want to piggyback on that just a little bit. Talk about the difference between working from an assignment document and working with a real idiot.
Thanks.
Kidding. Working with a real client, and having to meet their sometimes changing needs or sometimes needs. I mean, it's your document that you get for an assignment has pretty much everything you need there. So what's the difference between that and working with a human client?
So there's a lot of consultation, and you have to get really good at asking the questions over and over again, and sometimes you have to have the knowledge to ask the questions that they won't give you the information on. So we have to sit down and do a consult. We don't get a nice clean piece of paper with data that already exists. Lots of times we build that data for them, and we sit down and we're like, okay, color palette. Not something that would ever be on a design brief, something we pretty much do at our discretion as long as we don't make it neon for our class projects. But for Miss Etherson, we sat and we're like, okay, what color is checkout in your brain? Because if we make it that color, you'll click on it when you're supposed to. So little stuff like that like you would never really, that would totally be at your discretion for a class project. Like she has opinions, we have opinions, and we kind of had to make that all match.
And you did a great job with it, because sometimes I didn't know what questions needed to be asked or what I needed to make this work. So you guys were able to pull that out of me. That was what made it work.
How might teachers use, so you went through specifically and you picked November, which is an incredibly tumultuous politically month in terms of news and in our country and everything. How might teachers use, like we are constantly getting, the suggestion that we are indoctrinating all of those things. How could teachers use your lexicon and your program to check themselves and check the resources that they're using and show that to others as far as making sure that they're not providing biased resources?
So when I get this in a web application, it'll be a lot easier and a lot more intuitive. But for now, if you know enough to use the system that exists right now, you can do this large scale, like I did for my AP research project. You can put 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 documents in it, and it'll run right through them and give you all the averages. Or if you just want to say, hey, this particular news report makes me feel iffy, you just put the text from that document in there, and it'll give you an average that you can look at as sort of an indicator. So this actually works for transcripts also. For CNN 10, it's exclusively video based. So for my research, I used the transcripts from CNN 10. So you can use this on kind of an individual scale to just check what you're looking at, but then also kind of overarching, which is what I did. If you need to just put the research in somebody's face and say like, okay, I checked. This is not a bias source. Okay, thank you.
How do you combat that with fake news? Like, it doesn't matter when you show people true data, you're just gonna go, well, that's fake. Do you have a plan for that?
It's really, really difficult because it comes a lot from like intentional unwillingness to see the side of debate that comes up. And you're kind of always gonna have to fight the argument, because I can look at good, reasonable people and say, hey, hostile media perception, you totally can't tell. And you can still look back at me and say, no, yeah, I can. I can tell. I'm special. But you're obviously always gonna have to kind of have that argument. But having the data, I think there's sort of falls into kind of three subgroups of people of like willfully ignorant, regular ignorant, and like educated. So if you have the data to give to people, there's lots of people I think who just like kind of don't know. And I think you can probably change the minds that way. Obviously, you're always gonna have to deal with the willfully ignorant subsection.
Ray, do you have a question or a comment you'd like to make?
I was curious as to why you didn't add conservative news outlets when you're doing these comparisons, like Fox or Breitbart or.
Fun story about that. So the original project that I did this with was comparing student news sources to adult news sources in terms of their bias. So it was really important to me that I find student news sources that come from adult news. So like CNN 10 is an offshoot of CNN. It's from the same company, so you could kind of expect them to adhere to the same standards. I tried really hard to find a conservative outlet that had a student news outlet that I could put in this study, and they don't exist.
Oh, okay.
At least not in a way. The standard I set for this was it had to be cited in at least 2 articles somewhere else on the internet to say, hey, this is an actual source that we use in classrooms. And nowhere is there any like legitimately conservative source that has a student news.
That was a fascinating, great question, and it was a question I asked, as I think you probably asked it as well, of that, and it was that's a really interesting note, yeah.
Yeah, totally would have loved to put Fox News and its student news in here and compare it to everything else, but I really couldn't find one.
Fox interesting.
Mr. Sellers, you want to weigh in at all?
Well, it was very outstanding. I think you did a real good job. I can't imagine having to go through all that. And,
Yeah, I think if I ever have to open Adobe Acrobat again, I'll probably cry.
yeah. Welcome to my level of cynicism now, I guess. I'm curious though, and I know you talk about it and I get lost
It is
easily. No, that's all me. It's all on me. So the bias aspect of that, I think it's interesting. I just started reading. You'd like the book, but now I can't think of the name of it. I probably don't have service in here.
No, probably not.
Oh, I might gotta pull it up. But one of the the first chapter, they was talking about, and having been in political science and such as well for college, mastering the lexicon and changing things. You know, the idea of pro-life versus pro-choice. You know, there are marketers out there who know how to manipulate. By using that and thinking about running through all those politicians' talking points, which is mostly what their statements would be, do you think that could skew as they pull these? Because particularly, and I'm from a certain era, So I remember when, the Contract for America and Newt Gingrich, and they were on lockstep talking points all the time. So there is no diversity of thought. How do you control for that?
So the way that this does it is basically, it counts all the probability. So if I have 10,000 Republican speeches and the word fetus comes up in 80% of these speeches versus it coming up 30% in a Democratic speech, then you can kind of differentiate that if a document uses this word, it is likely to hold some kind of Republican bias because Republicans tend to use this language. So that's how you kind of tell, and it gets, a lot of the words in this lexicon are just slightly one way or the other. It's super unusual for it to be like completely one way or the other, and for an entire document to get a perfect -1 or 1 score, I think would be nearly impossible. But kind of having that lexicon be generated strictly off of probability, like no matter what they talk about, it's kind of scaled to how much they talk about it. So those like very lockstep opinions that are always coming back up, they get stronger and stronger in the lexicon as these people come up and keep talking about them. And so when you go back to analyze them in a source, it becomes, okay, the words that you're using here, very Democrat, very Republican, and it becomes almost certain that that's what you're looking at.
And let me one more with that. So in the book I was just reading, and you mentioned this, the shift in language, and the first chapter he talked about it was very similar to what you're talking about, how people respond to certain words, and he said inequality. When you say inequality, people, I don't want to hear you. Wealth concentration. Now you start saying these things, and people are much more receptive to it. If you say inequality, they hear these things over and over again, and they're little trigger words. They know when to growl.
Yes.
And so you mentioned that, and I don't know if I caught it or not. Is that something that could easily be, as language shifts, as language dynamic? How do you just have to go back in, or is it constant like the machine learning stuff? I don't know anything about that. Are you constantly just having to scrape and calibrate, recalibrate?
This system itself isn't constant, but if you were to hook it up to, say, votesmart.com directly, and that's something you would probably have to work with them on to get through their firewalls, but if it continued, say it worked in a 2-year time slot and just every day that passed it threw out the articles from the last day that made it out of it and kept updating, you could keep it constant like that, and I think that would be really cool if it could just be self-updating. But as of right now, this will probably be good for I want to say like a year or 2 years, but probably 6 months, given how fast like the way people are talking about things are changing. But it's a lot of the sources that I came upon, I looked at a lot of like political, because when a politician gives a speech, like the emotions that the words invoke are what you think about way before you ever think about the actual words. And I was talking with Jack about this yesterday, and he told me this, I believe it was a Winston Churchill quote that was like, the worst thing about capitalism is that some people are really bad off, but the best thing about socialism is that everyone's only a little bad off. And if you think about that for just a second, you can see how the language is meant to guide you to a certain viewpoint. So I was looking for something that like kind of got those triggers in a way that like somebody who wouldn't been taught to look for them could at least kind of have an indication.
But so like theoretically, this could be a dynamic thing.
Yes, you would have to set it up to take in the speeches as they come.
Learning as it goes.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, you could totally make it constant.
So, Mr. Barano, do you remember yesterday you asked about, how do we know, about what's reliable sources, and Mia said, come back tomorrow and I'll show you one way. Do you feel like this might be a way?
It's very complicated.
Yes.
It's very complicated for me to understand, so I really can't ask any meaningful questions about it at this time.
Well, let me put it.
Something did come up in my mind about tier words. We talk about first tier, second tier, third tier. I mean, the first tier are the most basic words that everyday people,
Mhm.
uneducated people use, and then you move up the ladder, more educated words, words that we got from the French language, for example, and then scientific and other words that are extremely esoteric. It would be interesting to see those based on the right-wing publications and left-wing publications, for example, which side used more tier 1 words versus tier 3 words.
Mhm.
It would just be interesting to see that.
So I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So you used politicians' speeches,
Yes.
Republican, Democrat, to determine partisanship. But to your point, do you think you could go back and use, let's say, the American Enterprise Institute and Center for Progress speeches, which may use more scientific words because of the audience they're speaking to, right? Politicians are speaking to the kind of everyman, but different right and left-leaning organizations may be speaking to different audiences. Do you think you could keep the partisanship, but still shift the audience?
Yeah, so the way this works is it's pretty much a self-contained system, so any document that you put in on the lexicon, it's gonna categorize those words, so you could probably add scientific documents and keep the partisanship completely intact. It would still just like, as long as you could accurately tag it as this is a Republican or this is a Democrat document, it can still do that probability analysis. The reason I ended up choosing senators is because of what you were talking about, that they're kind of talking to the everyman, because I knew I was going to use this to do news articles, and I wanted something that, like you said, was going to sit at about the same level of complexity of language. I wanted words that politicians use to be something that those words come up more frequently in news articles, so I wanted them in my lexicon.
So let's open, we'll open to the rest of the group here. Students, anybody else want to ask a question or make a comment?
I have a comment and a question. You explained machine learning and natural language processing really, really well. And then, did you just train it on speeches or also like tweets and things that they've said outside of the Senate?
There's tweets in there. It's every public speech, every public statement that they release over the 2-year period that I ended up analyzing. So yeah, there are tweets in there. The code that I based it off of found a way to remove them from the total corpus. I left them in there because I thought it was actually when they were at their most partisan and their most like free and like almost bias heavy, like they were showing their ideas the most. So I wanted to leave them in there because I thought it was kind of a good indicator of bias. Because nobody vets what you say on Twitter.
Good question. Here? Yeah.
Yes.
So you mentioned how you studied from 2020 to 2022, correct?
Yes.
So that time period, it's analyzing everything that was said from that time period, but you also, I think Mr. Thomas said something about constantly updating it,
Yes.
so it could be a little bit more timeless
Yes.
and restricted to this time period. If that becomes like an extension that you could hook up to Google, do you think if it becomes a little bit more widespread, they would be like instantly slandered by people or maybe even taken down?
Possibly, and likely, lots of sources that come out pretty much doing anything to indicate bias are going to run into those issues. All Sides for Schools is the most comfortably accepted one that I found, and even that has like, if you go on Common Sense Media or wherever the review is, you'll get reviews and reviews slamming it, because anytime, I don't want to say you tell people something they don't want to hear, but you tell people something that goes against what they are already believing, or you tell them you are incapable of determining this, let me tell you, people tend to have issues.
Any other questions? Yes.
Just moving away from this topic into your slide where you have the Smithsonian Institution, I believe if I'm correct, you said you would love to work there. Can you elaborate a little bit more? What is it that would interest you if you were offered a job there?
So I am very focused on information science, and the Smithsonian actually only physically shows about 3% of their collection at any given time. So they have like thousands and thousands and upon millions of artifacts that are never on display actually at the Smithsonian museums. And as it stands now, to get access to any of those, you pretty much have to go to the archives at the Smithsonian and get them to open it up for you. But what they're starting right now is a process where they're using AI and 3D modeling to make these 3D replications of these artifacts that they then make available on the internet, with all of the tagging and associated stories and notes and everything attached. So they're basically making a giant database of the entire Smithsonian collection, and I would really like to work on that because I think it's cool.
And while your project here was oriented towards politics and towards political beliefs, is that one of your passions, or was that simply something you chose for this project?
It is something that I really enjoy. They tell you when you write your dissertation, find something you like but not love because you'll hate it by the time it's over. So this is something that I really enjoy. I like citing sources. I like having an objective way to determine things. But overall, I really enjoy politics. I don't think that I will end up in there. I do really like to argue, but I think I'll probably end up somewhere in the more historic realm. If I end up in politics, it'll probably be as some kind of election consultant.
Thank you.
Ms. Etterton, you already kind of jumped in. You got anything else you want to?
Oh,
no.
Yeah. So, my brain goes off in a million directions when I'm listening to what you say. And if we can identify bias, then can't, like, media people use that identification of bias to then change their media in a way that is not as offensive, or can maybe recruit the other side?
Actually, that's kind of one of my favorite ways to use it, because if you are open to changing it, if you're the person who wrote that, this is a really good way, because language bias is so subconscious and so ingrained in the way you communicate, just the way that you're expressing your ideas. If you write something and you go back and check it with this system, it can tell you, okay, I'm leaning heavy Republican and I probably need to like go back and ease it up. So I think it's really good for just, if you are willing to check your own subconscious bias, it's a really good way to do that objectively.
And I know that AI is not machine learning, but we're moving towards AI domination, but not
Yes.
of people. Have you
Sure, not a
tried
problem.
to run any of your articles through AI and gotten an accurate response to the bias, or you're just like, I'm sticking to the facts and I'm not playing this nebulous game?
I have not, but that might be interesting. I wonder if ChatGPT can tell.
They actually don't like to commit politically, from my experience.
I have like done a little bit of work on it. I know they don't like to tell you what's going on with the politics.
Yeah.
So I wonder if they would tell you.
Is anyone else out here? I know we've got some other AI.
You can hack it, but you have to tell it you're playing a game.
Oh.
Or you have to ask it nicely. Found that out. You can literally just say like, I'm sorry, you're just supposed to tell me. And it's like, okay.
Cool. So I will wrap things up by saying thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. We thank you all for being here. If family, if you weren't your photo op, we can do that real quick, and then we're gonna re-rack and do this again for Nick and then Braden here in just a minute. So thanks guys for coming.